Television rarely produces a finale that inspires both reverence and courtroom-level argument, but The Sopranos achieved that feat by doing what it always did best, placing a family at a table and letting the atmosphere do the killing. The conclusion is straightforward. In Made in America, Tony Soprano is shot at Holston's by the man in the members-only jacket as he returns from the bathroom, and the cut to black functions as the sonic absence of the gunshot and the perceptual absence of Tony's point of view. The more interesting dispute is the one the series quietly invites, not whether Tony dies, but why this particular death happens now, why it happens so cleanly, and why the trail back to the source keeps circling one specific survivor who has always treated loyalty as a flexible concept with excellent resale value. The neatest answer is also the one audiences often prefer not to touch. Tony is not simply hunted, he is served, and the waiter is Paulie Gualtieri. Begin where the series itself begins, leaving fingerprints. Paulie is shown courting New York long before the final season needs a culprit. In the parking lot conversation with Johnny Sack, Paulie speaks about Tony with the kind of entitlement that passes for honesty among men who confuse seniority with virtue. He complains that Tony doesn't respect the elderly, and when Johnny mentions Carmine's frustration, especially around the Esplanade, Paulie offers an all-purpose pledge of service. If there is ever anything he can do, anything, he should not hesitate. The useful dodge is to insist Paulie was being played, as though the only betrayal that counts is one that succeeds. Paulie's willingness is the point. In that moment, he believes he is auditioning for a larger, stronger outfit by volunteering for any task implied by a conversation about a boss being frustrated with Tony. Whether Carmine later knows his name is irrelevant. The impulse is exposed. The show is not subtle about what happens to old guard men who feel sidelined. It spends 6 seasons watching Tony collide with the prior generation's wounded pride, Junior's insecurity, Richie's entitlement, Feech's nostalgia, Pussy's self-preservation. Each of those arcs ends in betrayal, open defiance, or a coup attempt. Paulie belongs to that lineage and carries the same toxin, a conviction that he deserves more than he receives, combined with the absence of any internal mechanism that would prevent him from shopping his grievances to the highest bidder. The pilot even announces the theme with the bluntness of a mission statement, the feeling of arriving at the end, of missing the ground floor, of the best being over. That anxiety does not produce humility in this world. It produces plotting. Plenty of characters lie. The series is populated by liars the way a kitchen is populated by knives. It would be odd if they were not there, and it is dangerous to pretend they are decorative. Paulie, however, is a specialist. He does not merely lie to avoid consequences. He lies to improve his position, to satisfy his ego, and to punish perceived slights. He tells Johnny Sack about Ralph's joke regarding Ginny, not because it advances New Jersey's interests, but because it gratifies Paulie to be the man holding the match near the gasoline. He lies to Tony about the Pine Barrens mess to protect himself and to shift blame onto Christopher. And he keeps the feud alive with the petulant insistence of a man who cannot tolerate being the second funniest person in the room, much less the second favored. He nurses resentment over Tony's favoritism toward Christopher, and later over Bobby's elevation, because Paulie treats hierarchy as a personal insult whenever it does not end with his name. David Chase, being David Chase, does not rely only on dialogue and psychology. He also uses images the way other writers use exposition, as blunt instruments disguised as set dressing. One of the more conspicuous motifs associated with betrayal is the laceless white shoes. Johnny Sack wears them in the hospital after his allocution. Bert wears them in the sequence that ends with his execution for floating the idea of switching sides. Then, Remember When pauses to show Paulie's white shoes, twice, through sustained, deliberate close-ups as he packs. This is not a passing detail, it is insistence. The series does not waste close-ups on footwear unless it is trying to make footwear carry meaning. In a show obsessed with who stands where, who sits where, and who is positioned to be seen, These shoes function like a tag, the wardrobe equivalent of a stamped file marked defector. Remember When then does what it always does when it wants to convict someone. It stages a scenario in which Tony's instincts are allowed to speak. Tony and Paulie are on the road, and Paulie behaves like an exposed wire. He talks too much, too loudly, too freely, as if secrecy is a superstition for other people. He recounts old crimes and nearly confesses at a dinner table, turning a routine trip into a liability tour. Tony's irritation is not just annoyance. It becomes the quieter, sharper question that has killed men before. Has Paulie ever really been tested? And if so, does he break? Beansy cannot answer, which is its own answer. The episode turns that subtext into a kind of confession through dream logic. Paulie dreams of pussy in his kitchen and asks the question every compromised man eventually asks. When the time comes, will he stand up? The phrasing is too precise to dismiss. Pussy's last moments carry the shameful request to sit down, to be allowed weakness before execution. Paulie is not merely afraid of being killed, he is afraid of being exposed as the same species of betrayer, the kind who folds when fear arrives. Under the bravado, the show finally shows what Paulie's machismo is protecting: panic about whether he is loyal or merely performatively alive. Then comes Paulie's gift, delivered with the show's customary contempt for subtlety. An espresso machine arrives, branded semi-automatic chrome, and the label is treated like a caption. In a narrative where Tony is contemplating whether to eliminate Paulie for suspected betrayal, the phrase reads less like an appliance and more like a weapon description. The manufacturer could have chosen any name. The script could have ignored it. Instead, the show places those words on screen and then cuts, almost immediately, to a New York boss being shot and killed, as if to ensure the audience understands the intended association. Gifts, guns, and the casual murder of leadership all belong to the same ecosystem. The Sopranos also loves its pop cultural mirrors, and it would be out of character for it not to nod to the Godfather films, a text it references constantly. In that mythology, the betrayer who sets up Don Corleone's shooting is named Paulie. Names in this universe are rarely neutral. They are jokes, echoes, and sometimes warnings. By the final season, two names stand out: Paulie, whose name carries the traitor's shadow, and Patsy, whose name carries its own grim resonance. It is the kind of parallel the series delights in, especially when it can weaponize homage into prophecy. The Patsy component is often treated as a footnote, which is convenient if the goal is to keep the betrayal story neatly contained. Patsy has motive that does not require imagination. Tony ordered the death of his twin brother, and Patsy has already been shown contemplating retaliation. The war with New York presents him with plausible deniability, and a collapsing organization offers him an incentive: a future without Tony. The show even gives a pointed, almost theatrical moment in Blue Comet, where Patsy and Paulie speak in a bathroom, and the audience is denied the audio. This is not ambiguity, it is orchestration. The series is forcing attention onto discomfort, onto secrecy, onto the fact that something is being agreed upon but not shared. When the only thing the audience is not allowed to know is what two resentful survivors are saying to each other during a war, the omission is doing the talking. This is where New York strategy becomes the missing rationale for the finale. Butch articulates a policy that is as clinical as it is revealing: cut off the head and do business with what's left. When asked specifically about Paulie, the answer is no. He is not a target. Not later, not if necessary, but no. In a war defined by symbolic hits, the exemption is meaningful. Leaving Paulie alive makes sense only if Paulie is expected to be manageable, or already aligned, or both. A truce is not a moral reset in this world. It is a business decision. The finale then devotes a suspicious amount of attention to Paulie's positioning, as though the camera is filing paperwork for a promotion. Outside Satrial's, Paulie accepts the construction job only after Tony offers it to Patsy first. The order matters. Paulie takes what is left, again, and his decades-long grievance about being passed over is both soothed and sharpened by the gesture. He is also dressed in a black leather jacket that visually echoes Tony's, a wardrobe decision that reads like succession planning delivered through costuming rather than dialogue. The show is not guessing at what comes next. It is staging the silhouette of the next boss while the current one is still standing there, distracted by the mechanics of keeping the place running. The scene ends with a final piece of characterization that is practically a memo. Paulie sits with his eyes closed, absorbing sunlight with the serene entitlement of a man who does not believe he is in danger. This, immediately after Silvio and Bobby have been taken out and after months of open conflict with New York. Tony, even after an alleged truce, chooses a booth at Holston's with a view of the door, because paranoia is the closest thing he has to wisdom. Paulie, by contrast, relaxes. He does not relax because he is brave. He relaxes because he believes he is safe. The only people who behave casually in a world of assassinations are the ones who believe they are not on the list, or the ones who helped write it. Then the cat arrives, because The Sopranos enjoys assigning a supernatural halo to the most aggressively human sins. The animal appears with an eerie tone, and it spends its screen time staring at Paulie with the fixed intensity of accusation. Tony remarks that the cat has already caught a mouse down in the cellar, an invitation to substitute the correct word in this universe: rats. The show even ties the cat's presence to Paulie's unique susceptibility to omens, visions of the Virgin Mary, cursed relics, ritual panic, so that judgment can look like whimsy while still feeling like condemnation. Whether the cat is a supernatural warning or a narrative device, the selection is telling. The episode singles out Paulie as the object of silent scrutiny. The religious imagery in the final scene carries the same barbed irony. Tony's onion ring is eaten with a rhythm that resembles a ritual, as though the show is staging a parody of communion for a man who has spent his life confusing appetite with entitlement. The Eucharistic echo is not reverent, it is cruelly apt. A man who mocks holy visions and lives by violence is granted a ceremonial last meal before being erased. The series is not offering redemption. It is reminding the audience that ritual does not cleanse anything. It merely gives people a script to follow while they continue being who they are. At this point, the operational question, how the shooter knows where to go, has an obvious answer if internal betrayal is accepted. Someone with access provides the location. The man in the members-only jacket does not need to tail anyone if the information is delivered. Attempts to solve the logistics by claiming the shooter followed AJ reduce surveillance to a schoolyard exercise. A competent assassin does not enter directly behind the person he followed, advertising the tail at the exact moment he needs invisibility. The more plausible explanation is the most boring, and therefore the most accurate. The diner is known because it is told. Even small props in the finale's orbit support that porosity. Paulie arrives at Satrial's carrying a box of barber scissors, a peculiarly specific item to feature unless it is meant to connect to the way New York has been conducting its own business. The show has staged critical meetings in salon-like settings, beauty shops, barbers, places that feel harmless and ordinary precisely because they are. Paulie's contact with Butch in a barbershop and his sudden possession of tools from that world read like the series' preferred method of implication. Show the object, trust the audience to follow the thread. Paulie's conduct around the Phil Leotardo hit is equally suggestive. He takes operational direction from Bobby as a personal insult, erupting as though hierarchy matters more than outcomes. He then reacts to news of the hit with a performance of shock, before driving off with the kind of urgency that looks less like grief and more like a need to relay information. The hit itself is botched in a manner that is strangely useful. Phil survives the initial attempt, his companion is killed, and Paulie later rationalizes the death with a line that implies a surprising tenderness for Phil's feelings in a moment when tenderness is not supposed to be on the menu. In a world where murders are messages, a botched hit that creates chaos while preserving leverage is not necessarily incompetence, it is utility. None of this requires Paulie to be a mastermind. That would give him more strategic elegance than his history supports. The more credible portrait is of a survivor who understands one principle perfectly. Self-preservation is the only doctrine that never loses a vote. Paulie made it through earlier eras by the skin of his teeth, survived the Pine Barrens, and outlasted the war with New York, not because he is the toughest man in the room, but because he is the most adaptable. His superstition, saints, curses, visions, reads less like spirituality and more like a coping mechanism for men who want fate to explain the choices they do not want to own. One reading treats those beliefs as comic texture, another treats them as camouflage. Either way, they help him avoid the uncomfortable clarity that loyalty would require. There is, admittedly, an interpretation that tries to rescue Paulie from the role of Judas by reframing survival as prudence. Under this view, Paulie remains alive because he keeps a low profile. New York deems him irrelevant and focuses instead on leadership figures like Bobby and Silvio. The show even offers a quasi-mythic explanation through Paulie's wings, implying a kind of protection, as though he is shielded by the very superstition that embarrasses him. This reading is comforting, but it still concedes the central fact. Paulie survives because he is exempted. Whether that exemption is earned through betrayal or granted through perceived harmlessness, the effect is identical. He is spared while others are removed, and the narrative takes the time to show that sparing, which is rarely how innocence is filmed. The camera work in Remember When is not merely suggestive, it is prosecutorial. Tony's suspicion is staged through objects framed like options, an axe on the boat, a fishing knife held in view long enough to become a thought, and a thrown bottle edited as a feint. Tony asks repeatedly whether Paulie told Johnny Sack about the joke, and Paulie denies it with rehearsed steadiness. The point is not that Tony suddenly becomes a philosopher. It is that the show is replaying the funhouse logic, where Tony's gut correctly identifies disloyalty once, and it is identifying it again. That escalation matters because it clarifies why Paulie survives. Tony considers killing Paulie, and Paulie senses it. The flashback to Pussy's murder is not nostalgia, it is diagnosis. Paulie watches the old playbook and realizes he could be the next body pushed into the sea. In that moment, New York stops being a rival and starts looking like shelter. That same housekeeping logic extends to late series business decisions. Paulie covets the most lucrative leadership slot, Jackie April's old crew, cycled through Richie, Ralph, and Vito. Yet when it is finally offered, he declines and calls it cursed. A man who measures respect in revenue does not suddenly become skittish about earnings unless a better arrangement is already in place, either in New York's orbit or as a controllable figure in New Jersey once Tony is removed. The finale's visual underline outside Satrial's reinforces the point. A camera angle turns the storefront signage into a momentary accusation, making the word liar appear to rise from Paulie's forehead. The series has returned to that sidewalk countless times, yet it saves this framing for its closing hour, labeling the beneficiary before the check is cashed. New York's motive is equally tidy. If the truce is real, it is real because it is profitable. Butch calls off open war because open war is expensive, not because grudges have been purified. Phil's death in front of his family creates a demand for closure that can be satisfied without reigniting chaos, provided the successor will not retaliate. Removing Tony after the truce is announced is therefore not a contradiction. It is the efficient, deniable end to an inconvenient leader. Even the cat's stare takes on that tone when read beside the show's supernatural palette. The animal arrives with emphasis, chooses Paulie with the focus of a witness, and lingers as though waiting for an admission. Tony's cellar line about a mouse, the later discussion of the Virgin Mary vision, and the eerie mood suggest judgment, as though the dead are allowed one last comment on the living. And then there is the strangely strategic quiet between Paulie and Patsy. Blue Comet includes a deliberately muffled bathroom conversation that forces attention onto posture and glances rather than words. Neither man looks comforted. Both look like employees awaiting the outcome of a restructuring they already know is coming. The silence plays like a redaction. In the chaos that follows, Patsy fires with conspicuous ineffectiveness, and the opposing shooters return the courtesy, producing a skirmish that kills nobody who matters and preserves the two men most useful after the dust settles. In the finale, Paulie's sunlit pose, eyes closed, reflector angled, body exposed, makes the same claim. This is a man who does not fear retaliation because he does not expect it. Pair that confidence with Patsy's unresolved grievance, and the who benefits question stops being philosophical. And when a boss vanishes, those spared rarely owe their luck to virtue alone entirely. That positioning is the point. Tony's empire is already declining, his crew already thinning, his judgment already compromised by the same arrogance he mistakes for strength. The man in the members-only jacket fires the shot, but the betrayal is older than the diner. It is present in the parking lot where Paulie seeks New York's approval, in the bathroom where conversations are deliberately unheard, in the shoes that mark men willing to defect, in the dream where Paulie asks whether he will stand up, and in the gift whose name reads like a weapon before the story cuts to a boss being executed. The editorial case against Paulie is not built on one clue elevated into certainty. It is built on accumulation, an early willingness to pledge anything to New York, repeated betrayals and lies for petty satisfaction, escalating resentment when passed over, a visual motif of defectors marked by the same white shoes, an episode built around Tony contemplating whether to eliminate Paulie, a finale that literally frames Paulie as liar while exempting him from New York's hit list, and a supernatural chorus, Cat, Virgin Mary, Omen, that seems to watch him the way the living refuse to. In the end, Tony Soprano is not undone by a grand ideological enemy. He is undone by the small, familiar selfishness he has tolerated for years, the kind that laughs, brings gifts, and offers anything to whoever looks most likely to win. The tragedy is not that Tony dies. It is that he dies in the most predictable way possible, surrounded by family, distracted by routine, and betrayed by the sort of man he kept close precisely because he mistook survivorship for loyalty. Subscribe for more.